In the late 16th century, Europe stood on the edge of a storm that would decide the fate of empires, religions, and the future balance of power on the seas. Imagine a time when the ocean was the ultimate battlefield, when wooden ships carried not only soldiers and cannons but the ambitions of kings and the destiny of nations. In 1588, England was a small but defiant island kingdom, surrounded by enemies, isolated in faith, and daring enough to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Spain ruled the waves, controlled vast riches from the Americas, and commanded the largest, most feared navy on earth. To many observers of the time, England's destruction seemed inevitable. Yet history was about to witness one of the greatest military upsets ever recorded, a clash where strategy, weather, leadership, and human courage collided to reshape the world forever. This story begins not with cannons firing, but with fear, faith, and political hatred simmering beneath the surface of Europe. By the 1580s, Spain was the undisputed superpower of the world. King Philip II ruled an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on Spanish lands. Gold and silver poured into Spain from the New World, funding massive armies and an unmatched navy. Spain's warships dominated the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, protecting trade routes and enforcing Spanish authority across oceans. England, by contrast, was smaller, poorer, and deeply divided by religion. Queen Elizabeth I had established England as a Protestant nation, directly challenging the authority of Catholic Europe and especially the Pope in Rome. To Philip II, Elizabeth was not only a political rival but a religious enemy, a heretic queen ruling a land that he believed should be returned to Catholic control. The tension between England and Spain was not sudden. It had been building for decades through political rivalry, religious conflict, and acts of economic warfare. England's sailors, often officially labeled as privateers but seen by Spain as pirates, attacked Spanish ships returning from the Americas. Men like Sir Francis Drake struck Spanish ports, captured treasure ships, and humiliated Spain on the open seas. These raids weakened Spanish finances and embarrassed King Philip II, who saw England's actions as acts of open hostility. At the same time, England quietly supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish-controlled Netherlands, further provoking Spanish anger. To Philip, England had crossed too many lines. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 was the final spark. Mary was a Catholic claimant to the English throne and a symbol of hope for those who wanted Elizabeth overthrown. Her death convinced Philip II that peaceful solutions were no longer possible. England, in his eyes, had declared war on Catholic authority itself. Philip II began planning what he believed would be a swift and decisive invasion of England. His goal was clear: overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, restore Catholic rule, and bring England back into the Catholic world. To accomplish this, Spain would assemble a massive fleet known as the Armada, a name that alone inspired fear across Europe. This fleet was designed not just to fight England's navy but to escort a powerful Spanish army from the Netherlands across the English Channel. Once landed, these battle-hardened troops would march on London, crush resistance, and end Elizabeth's reign. On paper, the plan seemed unstoppable. Spain had more ships, more soldiers, and far greater resources than England. Many European leaders believed England would fall within weeks. However, behind the appearance of Spanish confidence lay serious problems. Spain's empire was overstretched, fighting wars on multiple fronts across Europe and beyond. The Armada itself was a massive logistical challenge. Ships had to be gathered from across the empire, crews recruited, weapons loaded, and supplies prepared for a long and uncertain campaign. Many of the vessels were designed for transport rather than naval combat, heavy and slow, built to carry soldiers instead of engaging in fast-moving sea battles. Supplies were often inadequate, food was poorly preserved, and disease spread quickly among the crews even before the fleet set sail. Despite these issues, Philip II trusted that God was on Spain's side. He believed that divine favor would overcome any weakness in planning or preparation. In England, the threat of invasion caused fear but also unity. Queen Elizabeth I knew her kingdom faced an existential threat. England lacked the wealth and manpower of Spain, but it possessed something equally powerful: experienced sailors and innovative naval tactics. English ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than Spanish galleons. English commanders understood naval warfare differently. They emphasized speed, long-range cannon fire, and flexible tactics instead of close-quarters boarding actions favored by Spain. Elizabeth's leadership played a critical role. She balanced caution with boldness, inspiring loyalty among her people while carefully managing limited resources. England prepared for invasion not with arrogance, but with grim determination. As 1588 approached, tension gripped Europe. Churches prayed for victory, spies carried secrets across borders, and sailors waited anxiously in ports, unsure if they would ever return home. The Spanish Armada, consisting of over 130 ships and carrying more than 30,000 men, finally prepared to sail. It was the largest naval force ever assembled in European history up to that point. To many, its sheer size seemed proof that resistance was futile. Yet history often turns not on numbers alone, but on decisions, timing, and forces beyond human control. As the Armada moved toward the English Channel, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of power, faith, and survival, and determine whether England would be crushed beneath Spain's might or rise against impossible odds. As the Spanish Armada finally left port in the spring of 1588, it carried not only soldiers and cannons but the absolute confidence of an empire that believed victory was ordained. King Philip II did not personally command the fleet. Instead, leadership fell to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman with little naval combat experience but unwavering loyalty to the crown. Medina Sidonia himself had expressed doubts about the mission, warning that the fleet was unprepared and that England's waters were dangerous, but Philip dismissed these concerns. In his mind, the invasion was a holy mission, protected by God and justified by faith. The Armada's orders were precise: sail through the English Channel, avoid unnecessary battle, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, and escort those troops safely across to England. The plan relied on perfect coordination and calm seas, two things that war rarely provides. From the very beginning, nature seemed determined to challenge Spain's confidence. Storms battered the Armada as it left the Iberian Peninsula, damaging ships and forcing repairs before the fleet even reached the English Channel. These delays disrupted schedules and weakened morale. Meanwhile, English intelligence networks were active and alert. Scouts and lookout ships tracked Spanish movements, while signal fires stood ready along the English coast. England knew the Armada was coming, and unlike Spain, England expected battle. English commanders such as Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake prepared their ships not to defend the coast passively, but to strike aggressively at sea. They understood that allowing Spain to control the Channel, even briefly, could mean the end of England's independence. When the Armada finally appeared off the coast of England in late July 1588, the sight was terrifying. Spanish ships sailed in a powerful crescent formation, designed to protect vulnerable transport vessels and maintain discipline. From a distance, the Armada looked unstoppable, a floating fortress moving steadily toward its objective. But the English Navy did not rush blindly into combat. Instead, English ships shadowed the Armada, keeping their distance and testing Spanish defenses. This marked a fundamental difference in naval philosophy. Spain favored close combat and boarding actions, believing victory came from overwhelming force at short range. England favored long-range cannon fire, aiming to damage ships from afar and avoid direct engagement where Spanish numbers could dominate. The first clashes were cautious but revealing. English ships used their speed and maneuverability to harass the Spanish fleet, firing volleys and then retreating before Spanish guns could respond effectively. Spanish cannons were powerful but slower to reload, and their ships struggled to turn quickly in the narrow waters of the Channel. Although these early engagements caused limited physical damage, they exposed weaknesses in Spain's strategy. The Armada was not designed for sustained combat against fast-moving enemies. Supplies began to run low as ammunition was expended faster than planned, and damaged ships struggled to maintain formation. Still, the Armada pressed forward, determined to reach its rendezvous point with Parma's army. As the days passed, tension aboard both fleets grew. English sailors fought with the knowledge that defeat meant invasion, occupation, and the possible execution of their queen. Spanish sailors, many of whom had never seen combat at sea, faced exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of attack. Disease spread quickly in cramped conditions, and morale suffered as the reality of war replaced expectations of an easy victory. Despite these challenges, the Armada reached the waters near Calais, where it anchored to await communication from the Duke of Parma. This moment was critical. Spain needed time to coordinate the final phase of the invasion, but time was something England was unwilling to grant. Under cover of darkness, the English launched one of the most daring tactics of the entire campaign. They sent fireships drifting toward the anchored Spanish fleet. These ships were packed with flammable materials and set ablaze, turning them into floating infernos. Panic spread rapidly through the Armada. Fearing explosion and destruction, Spanish crews cut anchor cables and scattered to avoid collision. The carefully maintained formation that had protected the fleet for weeks was shattered in a single night. Though the fireships caused little direct physical damage, the psychological impact was enormous. Order gave way to chaos, and the Armada's defensive advantage was lost. At dawn, the English attacked again, this time with full force. The Battle of Gravelines became the turning point of the campaign. English ships closed in, unleashing sustained cannon fire at closer range than before. Spanish ships, disorganized and struggling to regroup, took heavy damage. Masts were shattered, hulls breached, and command structures collapsed amid smoke and confusion. The English avoided boarding, focusing instead on disabling ships and forcing them out of the fight. Spanish crews fought bravely, but bravery alone could not overcome tactical disadvantage. The sea itself seemed to favor England, as shifting winds allowed English ships to maneuver freely while pushing Spanish vessels toward danger. By the end of the battle, the Armada was badly wounded but not completely destroyed. However, the invasion plan was in ruins. With no safe way to reach Parma's army and English forces controlling the channel, the Spanish were forced to retreat. What followed would prove even more devastating than the battle itself. Instead of returning the way they came, Spanish ships were driven northward, forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland to reach home. This desperate journey, undertaken by damaged ships with exhausted crews and dwindling supplies, would turn retreat into catastrophe. The greatest navy in the world was no longer marching toward conquest. It was now fighting simply to survive, unaware that the worst losses were still ahead. As the shattered remnants of the Spanish Armada were pushed northward after the Battle of Gravelines, the conflict entered its most brutal and unforgiving phase. There were no glorious cannon duels now, no grand formations or strategic commands. What followed was a desperate struggle against nature itself. Spanish ships, many heavily damaged and barely seaworthy, were forced to abandon all hope of invasion and attempt a perilous journey home by sailing around the British Isles. This route was long, unfamiliar, and deadly, especially for vessels already weakened by battle. The English navy, though victorious, did not need to pursue aggressively anymore. The sea and the weather had become Spain's most powerful enemies, and they would prove far more destructive than English cannons. The Spanish fleet sailed north along the eastern coast of England and Scotland, where violent winds and rough seas battered their ships relentlessly. Crews struggled to keep damaged vessels afloat while battling exhaustion, hunger, and disease. Food supplies had rotted, fresh water was scarce, and scurvy and dysentery spread rapidly. Many sailors collapsed at their posts, too weak to work the sails or man the pumps. Command and discipline deteriorated as officers faced impossible choices, whether to attempt risky repairs at sea, abandon ships entirely, or press forward in hope of survival. Every decision carried the risk of death. The once proud Armada, assembled to conquer a kingdom, had been reduced to a scattered group of drifting, broken ships fighting the elements. As the fleet rounded the northern tip of Scotland, conditions worsened. Storms of extraordinary violence slammed into the Spanish vessels, tearing apart rigging and driving ships off course. Navigational charts of the region were poor or non-existent, and Spanish pilots had little experience with these waters. Miscalculations proved fatal. Ships were driven westward toward the rocky coasts of Ireland, where towering cliffs and hidden reefs waited in silence. One by one, Spanish ships smashed against the shore, breaking apart under the force of the waves. Thousands of sailors drowned within sight of land, trapped inside hulls or crushed by debris. Those who managed to reach shore often found no safety waiting for them. In Ireland, the survivors faced a grim fate. Many were wounded, starving, and barely able to walk. Local English authorities, fearing invasion or rebellion, ordered Spanish survivors captured or executed. Others were killed by exposure, disease, or local conflicts. Only a fraction of those who came ashore ever returned to Spain. The sea showed no mercy, and neither did the political realities of the time. By the time the remaining Spanish ships limped back to their home ports months later, the scale of the disaster had become clear. Of the more than 130 ships that had set out, fewer than half returned. Estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers were killed during the campaign, most of them not in battle, but through storms, shipwrecks, and starvation. England's losses, by comparison, were far smaller, though not insignificant. Disease claimed many English sailors as well, especially after the campaign ended, when overcrowded ships and poor sanitation took their toll. However, England had avoided invasion, preserved its independence, and achieved what many believed was impossible: the defeat of the world's strongest navy. News of the Armada's destruction spread rapidly across Europe, shocking allies and enemies alike. Spain's aura of invincibility was broken. While Spain remained a powerful empire, the psychological impact of the defeat was enormous. Other nations began to challenge Spanish dominance at sea, emboldened by England's success. For England, the victory transformed national identity. The survival of the kingdom was seen as proof of divine favor, reinforcing Protestant belief and strengthening Queen Elizabeth I's authority. Her leadership during the crisis elevated her to legendary status, symbolizing unity and resilience in the face of overwhelming danger. English naval confidence grew, encouraging further exploration, trade, and expansion overseas. The defeat of the Armada did not end the war between England and Spain, but it shifted the balance of power and marked the beginning of England's rise as a major naval force. Yet beneath the triumph lay harsh realities. War had exposed the vulnerability of sailors, the brutality of nature, and the thin line between victory and annihilation. Thousands of families in Spain mourned lost sons, husbands, and fathers, while England quietly buried its own dead, aware that survival had come at a cost. The Spanish Armada of 1588 became a lesson written in blood and wreckage, demonstrating that no empire, no matter how powerful, could command the sea without respect for strategy, preparation, and the uncontrollable force of the natural world. The consequences of this disaster would echo through European politics for decades, reshaping alliances, ambitions, and the future of global naval warfare. In the months and years that followed the destruction of the Spanish Armada, Europe struggled to fully understand what had just occurred. This was not merely a failed invasion or a lost fleet. It was a turning point that exposed the limits of imperial power and the unpredictable nature of warfare. Spain had entered the campaign with overwhelming resources, religious certainty, and the confidence of global dominance. Yet the campaign revealed how even the strongest empire could be undone by flawed planning, rigid strategy, and an inability to adapt under pressure. The Armada's defeat forced Spanish leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about their navy, their command structure, and the dangerous assumption that faith alone could guarantee victory. King Philip II publicly accepted the defeat with outward calm, famously stating that he had sent his fleet to fight men, not the winds and waves. Privately, however, the loss was devastating. Spain's treasury, already strained by constant warfare, was pushed closer to collapse. Rebuilding the fleet required enormous financial investment, and although Spain would eventually recover much of its naval strength, the sense of absolute superiority was gone forever. Spain remained a powerful empire, but the psychological damage was permanent. Other European nations now saw that Spain could be challenged and defeated. The myth of Spanish invincibility, carefully built over decades, had been shattered in a single campaign. England, on the other hand, emerged from the crisis transformed. The victory did not instantly make England the world's leading naval power, but it changed how England viewed itself and how others viewed it. English shipbuilders, commanders, and sailors studied the campaign closely, learning valuable lessons about naval warfare, logistics, and long-range gunnery. The emphasis on speed, maneuverability, and disciplined cannon fire became defining characteristics of English naval doctrine. This shift would shape England's approach to warfare at sea for generations. The Armada proved that naval battles were no longer decided solely by size or numbers, but by innovation, flexibility, and intelligent leadership. The political impact within England was equally significant. Queen Elizabeth I's authority was strengthened at a critical moment in her reign. Before the Armada, her rule had faced internal opposition, religious tension, and questions of succession. After the victory, she was celebrated as the protector of the nation, a symbol of stability in a dangerous world. Her leadership during the crisis, particularly her ability to inspire loyalty and confidence, unified the country across social and political lines. The sense of shared survival created a powerful national identity, one rooted in defiance against overwhelming odds. This emotional unity would support England through future conflicts and expansions. Beyond politics and military strategy, the Armada's defeat had lasting consequences for global exploration and trade. With Spain's dominance weakened, other nations became more aggressive in pursuing overseas expansion. English merchants and explorers pushed further into the Atlantic, laying the foundations for future colonies and trade networks. The seas, once considered Spain's uncontested domain, became increasingly competitive. While Spain continued to protect its interests, it now faced rivals willing to challenge its claims. The struggle for control of the oceans had entered a new phase, one that would eventually shape the modern world. Despite England's triumph, the human cost of the campaign remained a haunting reality. Thousands of lives had been lost, not only in battle but through starvation, disease, and shipwreck. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars, and the memory of the disaster lingered among Spanish communities for generations. The Armada became a symbol of both ambition and tragedy, a reminder that grand visions of conquest often ignore the fragile human lives required to carry them out. For sailors on both sides, the campaign reinforced a painful truth. At sea, even the best-laid plans can be destroyed in a single storm. As time passed, the story of the Spanish Armada was shaped into legend, often simplified into tales of divine intervention or heroic destiny. In reality, the outcome was the result of complex interactions between politics, technology, leadership, and chance. The defeat did not end the rivalry between England and Spain, but it altered its course. From this point forward, power on the seas would no longer belong to a single empire. The events of 1588 marked the beginning of a new era, one where adaptability mattered more than tradition, and where the future of nations would be decided not only by faith or force, but by the ability to learn from failure and survive the unforgiving realities of war. The legacy of the Spanish Armada did not fade with time. Instead, it continued to shape wars, ambitions, and fears long after the wreckage had disappeared beneath the waves. What truly made 1588 unforgettable was not just that England survived, but that the balance of power in Europe had permanently shifted. The oceans were no longer a stage dominated by one empire's will. Spain had learned, at unbearable cost, that sheer size and religious certainty could not overcome poor coordination, rigid thinking, and the uncontrollable forces of nature. England had learned something equally important, that survival against overwhelming odds was possible through preparation, adaptability, and the courage to fight differently. These lessons would echo through future naval conflicts for centuries to come. For the men who lived through the campaign, victory and defeat were deeply personal experiences. English sailors returned home exhausted, sick, and scarred, many dying shortly after from disease rather than enemy fire. Spanish survivors carried memories of terror, watching comrades swept away by storms or crushed against rocks, powerless to help. Families on both sides waited for ships that never returned, their losses unrecorded by glory or celebration. Behind every strategic victory and political outcome were thousands of human stories, filled with fear, hope, and irreversible loss. The Spanish Armada stands as a reminder that history's greatest events are built on individual lives, often forgotten once the cannons fall silent. Over time, England's victory was woven into national identity, celebrated in speeches, art, and storytelling as proof of resilience and destiny. Yet the real significance lies deeper than pride. The Armada demonstrated a new kind of warfare, where intelligence, communication, ship design, and leadership mattered as much as numbers. It showed that wars are rarely won by strength alone. They are won by those who understand their enemy, adapt to changing conditions, and make decisive choices under pressure. This shift in thinking laid the groundwork for England's future as a global naval power, influencing conflicts far beyond its own shores. Spain, though wounded, did not disappear from history. It continued to fight, trade, and rule vast territories, but the confidence that once defined its empire was permanently shaken. Other nations, inspired by England's survival, dared to resist Spanish dominance. The defeat of the Armada became a warning to every great power that followed. Control of the world's oceans is never guaranteed. Empires rise, challenge one another, and fall, often faster than expected. The events of 1588 proved that history can turn in a single season, shaped by decisions made under pressure and forces no one can fully control. As you reflect on the story of the Spanish Armada, remember that this was more than a naval battle. It was a moment where politics, religion, technology, and human endurance collided, changing the course of history forever. If you feel that our videos are giving you accurate information and meaningful insight into real battle histories like this one, then support our work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war series. Your support helps us continue bringing you realistic, engaging, and well-researched stories from the most defining battles the world has ever seen. When historians look back at the Spanish Armada of 1588, they do not see a simple story of one navy defeating another. They see a defining moment where the future direction of the modern world quietly changed course. This was a conflict born from politics, religion, pride, and fear, but decided by human choices under pressure and the brutal indifference of the sea. England's survival was not guaranteed by destiny alone. It was shaped by calculated risks, innovative thinking, and the refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. The Armada's failure proved that power built only on reputation and tradition could crumble when confronted by adaptability and determination. From this moment forward, no empire could assume permanent control of the oceans. The psychological aftermath of the campaign mattered as much as the physical destruction. Across Europe, rulers and generals re-evaluated their assumptions about warfare. Naval power was no longer measured solely by the number of ships or soldiers, but by how effectively those ships could fight, maneuver, and sustain themselves at sea. Intelligence gathering, flexible command structures, and realistic planning became essential. England absorbed these lessons deeply. Over time, they shaped a naval culture that valued experience, innovation, and initiative. This cultural shift would later allow England to project power far beyond its shores, eventually influencing global trade, colonization, and geopolitics for centuries. At the same time, the Armada reminded the world that war always carries unintended consequences. Spain did not collapse after 1588, but the strain of constant conflict slowly weakened its economy and influence. The resources spent rebuilding fleets and maintaining distant wars drained wealth that could never be fully recovered. Internally, confidence eroded. Externally, rivals grew bolder. The defeat marked the beginning of a long, gradual decline rather than an immediate fall. History rarely moves in sudden endings. Instead, it shifts direction quietly, one critical event at a time. The Armada was one of those events, a hinge upon which European power slowly turned. For ordinary people, the legacy of the Armada was far removed from royal courts and political speeches. Coastal communities remembered the wrecks that washed ashore, the bodies carried in by tides, and the foreign sailors who begged for mercy. Survivors spoke of endless nights battling storms, praying not for victory, but simply for land. These human experiences strip away the romantic image of naval warfare and reveal its true nature: confusion, terror, endurance, and loss. The Spanish Armada teaches us that behind every famous battle are countless untold stories of suffering that history often compresses into a single sentence. Even today, the Spanish Armada continues to fascinate because it represents something universal. It is the story of a powerful force convinced of its own righteousness, confronting a smaller opponent that refused to accept its fate. It is a warning about overconfidence and a lesson in humility. It shows how leadership decisions, environmental forces, and human resilience can overturn expectations. Most importantly, it reminds us that history is not inevitable. Different choices, different weather, or a single delayed decision could have changed everything. England's future, and perhaps the future of the modern world, balanced on that uncertainty. As this chapter of history closes, the echoes of 1588 still resonate across the oceans. Shipwrecks rest silently beneath the waves, while nations continue to compete for influence and security on the seas. The Spanish Armada remains a symbol of ambition tested by reality, of power challenged by ingenuity, and of how wars are rarely won by strength alone. If you feel that our videos are giving you accurate knowledge and real insight into important battle histories like this one, then show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you can watch our latest war series. Your support allows us to continue sharing realistic, engaging, and well-researched stories from the battles that shaped our world.